Hi everyone, welcome to my office here on Parliament Hill. I'm sitting right kitty corner to the Supreme Court of Canada. I've been lucky to be in this office for the past 15 years, and it's a great place to work from. Now, of course, because of COVID-19, we've been mainly working from home, and serving our constituents has been taking up the lion's share of our time. As I did in my speech on Tuesday in the House of Commons, I want to give a big shout out to my staff. Lisa Jablonski, Lindsay Gudmundsson-Galbraith, John Franco, all in my constituency office, and up here in Ottawa, I have Dana Seymour Clahosi, Megan Lane, and Laura Kosh, who have just done yeoman service in making sure that our constituents are getting the information they need, as well as still dealing with all the other case files that come in all the time. Our office in Selkirk remains closed to the public, but we are working, and Lisa is there every day. John Franco and Lindsay do pop in, but we will, and I'm trying to get there at least once a week. And I can tell you that we are starting to get ready to set up for taking meetings again by appointment only. We're going to install some safety glass and also bring in some health protocols so that when people are coming into the office for meetings, when a phone call is not enough or a Zoom meeting won't suffice, then we'll definitely do a face-to-face, but I'm going to ask everyone, for the protection of my staff and for your own personal protection, that we all wear face masks and also practice good hand washing and sanitization. Now, we're doing this Facebook Live event so I can answer some of the questions that have been coming in, both from the post last night, what's been coming into my office, over the last while. A lot of people have sent me Facebook messages, and so we're going to deal with those in a little bit. Up here in Ottawa is where our democracy is seated. It's where your elected representatives come together and represent you and be your voice, and on top of that, we pick up our national files that we're responsible for, and of course, I'm the Shadow Minister for National Defence. It's a position that I'm very proud to hold. I've been on the defense file now for the better part of 9 years, and I really believe our country couldn't function if it wasn't for the brave men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who protect us, both here at home and abroad, who stand up for Canadian values around the world and are standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. So it is important that we support our troops and our military every step of the way. Now, I can tell you that the work that our Canadian Armed Forces are doing, there's over 1,700 members that are part of Operation Laser, which is the soldiers who were put into long-term care facilities in Quebec and Ontario. As I was questioning over the first part of this week, there is two reports out now that paint, especially in Ontario, appalling conditions, horrific medical outcomes for patients, abuse and neglect and lack of feeding. Some of these homes were actually, infested with cockroaches, and food was spoiling throughout the kitchen and dining area. It was disturbing to read that report. It's 21 pages long, and it really does paint a grim picture of the care that our loved ones are getting in certain senior homes in Ontario. Wasn't as bad in Quebec, but there's no question that our military had to fill in the gap when workers walked off the job, and they have done just a great service to Canada and a great service to those seniors and coming in and put themselves in harm's way. At last reported number is 39 Canadian Armed Forces members are now infected with COVID-19. And as I asked the Prime Minister, as well as to Minister Sajan, is do we have enough personal protective equipment for our forces that are in those facilities? Have they received enough training? Because most of these are infantry soldiers, and on each team there's at least one nurse, and maybe you'll have a few other soldiers who are actually medics, that they have military and medical training. But the rest of them are predominantly from the forces as either sailors, soldiers, or as aircrew, and now they are putting themselves in harm's way. And so we want to make sure that they are being taken care of, that they are compensated appropriately for the hazards that they're facing. Now, I guess the big story out of this week is that we're still in this hybrid committee of the whole, a special COVID-19 committee. We are able to debate in a proper House of Commons for 2 days, and Conservatives fought for the return of Parliament. Now, we're not suggesting that we would come back like the National People's Congress in China, where the Communist members are sitting shoulder to shoulder, wearing their masks. What we're talking about is that we would come back in a reduced number through parliamentary agreement between the House leaderships of each of the parties, and would still respect social distancing, but that Parliament would be functioning, that committees would be operating, and that we'd be able to hold the Trudeau government to account. What we have right now is government by news conference out in front of the Rideau Cottage, and that is no way to conduct a democratic country. And what was done is the NDP made a backroom deal with the Liberals and are propping up the Liberal minority government, and essentially allowing the Liberals to continue to operate without a real Parliament sitting. And so we do have these special COVID committees that's meeting for a couple hours. Now it's up to 4 times a day. Part of the caucus and caucuses are of course sitting in the chamber, and the rest are coming through the Zoom meeting system. So they're joining us virtually. So I had the honor this week of being in the House for 4 days, and 2 of those were regular parliamentary days, and 2 of them were the special COVID-19 committee of the whole. The sad part in all this is, even though now we can ask questions of the government beyond issues surrounding COVID-19 and the way the government has handled it or mishandled the situation, we can ask other questions. And so in today's session, my friend David Sweet got up and asked a question about the Hong Kong protesters who are now political prisoners. 360 of them arrested by the Hong Kong police because they were speaking out against the People's Republic of China, how the National People's Congress and the Communist Party of China has brought forward a motion that will ultimately force them to accept the Chinese national anthem. And of course, Hong Kong has always been, first, a member of the Commonwealth, secondly, is an autonomous region that is slowly having its independence eroded and being absorbed into China. The students there, the freedom fighters, those who believe in democracy and free speech and human rights have, of course, spoken up against it. So David asked us questions. The government had no answers, scared to, at all insult the regime in Beijing. And so I got up on a point of order and said, this is the very reason why we need to have an emergency debate, where parliamentarians can sit in the House and have a fulsome debate for 4 or 6 or 8 hours about the political prisoners, the peaceful protesters who have been arrested in Hong Kong, and stand up for human rights, to stand up for democracy, and to stand up with our allies in Hong Kong. And of course, I got shot down. The speaker said that the decision made by the Liberals and the NDP, essentially, that we only work in committees of the whole, will not allow us to take our place in the House of Commons and to speak about this terrible ordeal. You know, we should be having an emergency debate right now on the care of our loved ones in long-term care facilities and the appalling conditions that were described in the report from the Canadian Armed Forces. We aren't allowed to do that. So all we have is little 5-minute debates between a member of Parliament and a minister. That isn't how our parliamentary democracy is meant to operate. That isn't how our government is held to account. So Justin Trudeau may want to run away from Parliament Hill and hide out in Rideau Cottage, but we will keep fighting to ensure that Parliament sits. You know, it was noted the other day that by the time we come back, and hopefully to a regular session of Parliament on September 21st, that this Parliament that started sitting last fall, has only sat for 44 days. Got to remember, Justin Trudeau brought us back late at the end of November, and we only sat for a few weeks, and then we only got sitting again at the end of January, and before we know it, March 13th session was suspended, and we've been operating now in these special COVID committees of the whole. We're still without a budget. You know, it is inherent upon the government of the day to present their spending plans. But instead, we're operating through what they call special warrants that are all done through cabinet and orders in council. They have, of course, for great new spending, like we have seen in the emergency response benefits for COVID, and the business program and the wage subsidy and the commercial rent assistance, and all these different programs have had to require Parliament to come back for brief little sessions, and there's been essentially a lot of backroom negotiations taking place, and then those bills are passed and the spending is approved. But we're talking about over $250 billion in new spending. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is already predicting that the deficit this year, just based on the first quarter of expenses, is going to be $252 billion. That is what we used to spend during the Harper years for an entire year. And we're spending that in one quarter for a special relief, which of course is desperately needed by so many individuals and businesses. But at the end of the day, we are, of course, piling on more and more debt. Last year, total spending for the Government of Canada was $350 billion. And we, of course, had a deficit of around $23 billion on that. Now, revenues to the government aren't going to be there this year. We know that we have unemployment rates going to be pushing 15%. We know that we're going to continue to see declining business taxes, personal taxes being brought into government coffers. And yet there's still all the main spending that the government has to do, the equalization payments, the healthcare transfers to the provinces, the social transfers to the provinces. All those things still need to take place. And so where's the budget to prove all of that? Where is the planned spending of the government? And of course, without Parliament sitting, we don't have these normal mechanisms which are the foundation of our democracy. The oversight of Parliament on how taxpayer dollars are spent is virtually been taken away from us. We're going to do actually what they call the main estimates. The supplementary estimates are coming in at the end of this session for 2 days, that they will again sit as Parliament to deal with the main estimates, again mostly through a committee of the whole, and that committee will have to critique all the spending of the government in less than 2 days. That work usually happens department by department, standing committee by standing committee, where the expertise of individual MPs are focused on those departments at standing committees. And unfortunately, that's not happening. There's going to be very little accountability, unfortunately, through this process. Now, friends, I've had a number of questions that have come up over the last while. Norma asks, and I'll try to answer these questions one at a time here. So Norma asks, when are seniors going to get their money? And unfortunately, Norma, like most of these Liberal programs, they promise early, they promise big, but then you have to wait for the actual bureaucracy to catch up. And so those checks haven't been written yet or directly deposited into your accounts. And there was no timeline promised by Justin Trudeau and his cabinet. Now, my buddy Lauren, he asked this question: what's going to happen with the firearms ban? Now, I think a lot of us have been following this. I did a Zoom town hall on this a couple of weeks ago, and we had over 60 people participate in that call. And we talked about what Bill Blair and Justin Trudeau have done. First and foremost, the way they went about this is just completely crass. To actually use the tragedy of the massacre in Nova Scotia and to politicize those victims and their families, to make a new policy to take away firearms from law-abiding citizens. You know, those firearms that were used in that horrific situation we know for a fact that they were stolen, they were smuggled in, they weren't at all, well, he was not a licensed firearms owner. And, you know, we always know that it's the criminals will always get their guns. The criminals always commit these crimes, and law-abiding firearms owners are the ones that are then targeted by the Liberals. It's lazy government policy to try to take the firearms out of the hands of people that practice safe storage and handling, that are gun collectors, that are hunters, that are farmers, or, you know, or sports shooters. It's just bizarre that we have government that continues to vilify those who are some of the most law-abiding citizens in the country. There was a study done a number of years ago by the University of Calgary that actually, and we actually asked the Library of Parliament for this information as well, and they came up with the same results, is that over 99% of firearms owners ever commit a crime, because legal firearms owners cherish the privilege of owning their firearms, and they practice safe storage and handling, and they enjoy collecting, and they enjoy going out and target practice or entering sport shooting competitions or using their firearms for hunting. And for the Liberals to go and say that firearms that look a certain way and then to call them military assault rifles is wrong, because we all know that military assault rifles have been banned from civilian use since the 1970s. We all know that handguns have had to be registered in this country since 1935. And we all know that all the thugs and the gangs and the punks on the street that go out and commit these crimes, and they got their Glocks and they got their midnight specials and mainly handguns, are all smuggled up from the United States. So that's where the resources should be put, is stopping that illegal trade, securing the borders from the smuggling of firearms, and making sure that police and border security officers have the resources to go out there and stop the gun smugglers. I want to encourage everyone to sign an e-petition that's up right now. It's e-petition 2574. It's sponsored by my colleague Michelle Rempel-Gardner, and that e-petition is garnering thousands and thousands of names. I would love to see this be the biggest e-petition in Canadian history, and see that number go up to 100,000 Canadians that are opposed to Bill Blair's gun grab. And I know that there's a follow-up question on this. It says, well, why are First Nations and Aboriginal peoples and other Indigenous Canadians exempt? They still get to hang on to their AR-15. It doesn't make any sense at all. If it's okay for people that are Indigenous to have firearms that are of that style, because guess what? The AR-15, you know, which has the same firing mechanism that I have in my Gopher rifle. It's a semi-automatic. You know, it's got a mandated, regulated clip size of 1 in the barrel, 3 in the magazine. It's no different than a lot of hunting rifles out there. And so First Nations are keeping them, then it should be good enough for all other Canadians to also keep them. There shouldn't be these exemptions. It should be standard practice right across the board. Now, Wayne asks, do you support a public inquiry on the event in Nova Scotia? And I believe that there needs to be a royal commission, either provincially or federally, into what happened there. There needs to be some way to bring closure for all of the families who lost loved ones in the massacre. And so I do support that. These inquiries usually cost some money, but it's about getting down to the bottom of what played out, what lessons can be learned, and how can we respond better the next time that one of these situations arise. Marcel asks, how about what is the use of Parliament if the Prime Minister is never held accountable? He avoids the answers or he just doesn't answer. He has a minority government and acts like he has full power. So that's a great question, Marcel. And as I was saying earlier, Justin Trudeau, I actually think, doesn't appreciate Canadian democracy. He doesn't appreciate the Westminster-styled system. And what he said when he was in opposition, when they were in the third party before he became leader, he used to rail on Conservatives for trying to close down debate on certain items after we let debate range on for days and hours, and he'd get up and complain about it. But now that he's in the government, they have used closure to shut down debate in this House time and time again, including on Tuesday. They used closure to force a vote on Tuesday night. So we have a Prime Minister who we all know has this admiration for China's basic dictatorship and wants to act like one. So his governments by his tent outside of Rideau Hall is a great example of how he would rather just talk to the friendly media, who he's all bought off by either completely subsidizing CBC or has thrown millions and millions of dollars at the rest of the media, that they decide who's the winner and the losers are within our national media, and put out close to $700 million into supporting our so-called independent news. So we have a situation where the Prime Minister can act like he is in full power. And right now, with Parliament shut down, we can't even bring forward a vote of non-confidence. Not that the Bloc or the NDP would support us in that. The NDP are the ones that are supporting the government to continue functioning the way it is. The Bloc supported them in the last tranche of COVID-19 motions to allow them to continue to move on. So this is a very disappointing result of this pandemic, is that when all our municipalities, at our town councils, our municipal councils are still meeting, when every legislative assembly across this country meets all the time, when all the other major democracies, including dictatorships like China and the National People's Congress, are meeting right now, we are not. What you see on TV is not Parliament anymore. That is a virtual or a hybrid parliamentary committee. So it's not the sitting of the House of Commons or the Senate. So that is a good question, and one that we'll continue to have to explain to Canadians, because a lot of people don't understand the difference between what happens in Parliament and what happens at committee, what happens in Parliament, what happens at provincial levels. And so we need to always take that time to talk to our friends, our neighbors, and our family. It's our democratic responsibility to explain that what's happening right now isn't democracy. Ange asks, is the federal government an essential service? Yes or no? I say yes. It has to be one way or the other. And she's saying, why is Parliament not sitting as usual with protocols for health and safety in place? And I think I've already kind of explained that, Ange, that we have this situation where the Liberals and to a great degree now the NDP, are using the pandemic as an excuse not to have Parliament sit. And under our Westminster-styled parliamentary system, which is based upon what happens in the United Kingdom, who are meeting as we speak, we have this great opportunity to actually have Cabinet and the Prime Minister sit in our House of Commons, where we get to question them every day, where we get to deal with the issues that Canadians are facing, and we get to debate the legislation that the government wants to bring forward, as well as the legislation that's brought forward by private members. Unfortunately, and maybe it's not unfortunate, but as a private member, I can't bring forward any legislation right now. I can't table a single bill. But at the same time, neither can the government. And we know what type of legislation the Liberals have brought in the past. You know, what's happening with the gun grab, for example, the firearms ban that Bill Blair's doing through order in council, completely non-democratic. But what empowered him to be able to do that was Bill C-71, which they passed in the last sitting of Parliament. So they did that before the last election. And that gave them the power and the right to go ahead with this undemocratic, unaccountable firearms ban of over 1,500 different styled firearms. You know, we could also be facing who knows what coming from the Liberals that they would bring forward that would either even make life more expensive for all of us. So in one way, and this is just a very minor way, is at least the Liberals aren't bringing forward any more of their pet projects and pieces of legislation that would hurt our democracy or would set Canada back. There is that little bit of good news. But overall, it is the right of the government to bring forward legislation. And so Trudeau doesn't even have a legislative agenda that he wants to proceed with. So it just shows that after 5 years, Justin Trudeau is out of ideas. That after 5 years, Justin Trudeau, he doesn't want to deal with Parliament and democracy. He just wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to be the Prime Minister and have, every day to stand up in front of the press corps and give out his answers and that he wants to give and never answer the questions that are being asked. So there's also a question that's, are they not willing to resume Parliament, and should the parties who are stopping it have their wages cut? Actually, if you want to read a really good article, it came out yesterday in the National Post. Rex Murphy, who used to be on CBC, and somebody I have a great deal of admiration for, one of the most articulate and intelligent individuals I've ever got to listen to. He actually wrote that if parliamentarians aren't willing to take their seat, then they should just resign. For those that don't want to be in the House working, then who are they representing? I know that we are still providing our constituents service through our staff and our offices and through our personal phone calls. But I know at the same time that they are the ones that also say, we don't want to be in the House. You know, we're scared we might get sick. But this is where it comes down as essential service. That, yeah, there's risks in being in public. But at the same time, all of you that are still working, working in healthcare, working in grocery stores, working on frontline services, working in other essential services that have been deemed. There's even those that are in Manitoba. Some of our restaurants are starting to open up again, with reduced capacity. But the waiter and the waitress that are coming to your table are now an essential service. They're back at work. They're taking risks. And all of us as parliamentarians should be prepared to take the equal risk as our constituents. So, I just do encourage everyone to go and read that article in the National Post by Rex Murphy. I think he paints a very strong argument why Parliament needs to sit. And COVID-19, biggest crisis that Canada has faced since World War II, the biggest economic situation that we've had to deal with since the dirty 30s, and we're not sitting? Ridiculous. Now we got the crisis in our long-term care homes, where over 70% of the deaths from COVID-19 have occurred. We've seen these horrible conditions that were reported by the military, and again, Parliament's not sitting. That isn't acceptable. So, there's a number of things that Parliament can do, and maybe as Conservatives, and this actually crossed my mind earlier today. At any point in time, we could all march back in there and demand Parliament reopen. Unfortunately, because of the motion that passed on Tuesday night, the government can completely ignore us and leave us sitting there until September 21st. But we need to keep raising the questions. We need to keep approaching the government. Canadians need to write to their MPs and say, you deserve to be represented. Get back to work. Debbie and Elizabeth asked, why are we funding the Chinese quest for a vaccine? We should be doing our own research here. So I'll just say this, that there is a story out there right now. Just see another, I'll go back to that, Megan. There is a story that was out earlier this week that the Government of Canada is providing some money to a laboratory in China that is doing research on finding a vaccine to COVID-19, of course, where it all started. And of course, anything to do with any national institution within the Chinese government, of course, all is controlled by the Communist Party of China. And I have great apprehension of using any Canadian taxpayer money to go into the government of China. How can we be guaranteed that those dollars aren't going to be diverted into the People's Liberation Army of China? How can we guarantee that those dollars aren't going to go into into Beijing and the regime and their espionage that they do around the world, including here in Canada, including hacking that we've seen done by the People's Liberation Army against Canadian operations? So it just, to me, is ridiculous that we are sending any money to China, knowing how they're the ones that allowed this COVID-19 to take off, how they tried to cover it up, how they had doctors and journalists who spoke out against or started reporting and sounding the alarm bells back in November, December, and early January, and most of those people either died or disappeared. There needs to be accountability here, and trying to throw dollars at them to deal with vaccinations. Let's put that money into our own research institutions here in Canada. We have the National Microbiology Lab right in Winnipeg, where they've already done some great work, and I know that the more research we can do, the sooner that we're going to get to that vaccine that we have if we want to get to any level of normalcy. Now, I've had many times questions about whether or not vaccines should be mandatory, and I can tell you I'm opposed to mandatory vaccination. It's not law in Canada, but I do highly encourage everyone to get vaccinated. It has proven time and time again as the greatest way of stomping out major diseases, and all you have to do is think to polio and smallpox and how we got those all stomped out because of vaccinations. Like, we vaccinated our kids for mumps and measles now, and I see this as being a way forward for us to have a healthy population and a prosperous population. There's a question here again from Ange. Has it been confirmed that our troops in Operation Laser will get hazard pay? That hasn't been confirmed, but the answer that I got from Minister Sajjan yesterday during the COVID Special Committee sure sounded like that's about to be approved, but they are looking at it. They have to bring it forward from National Defence into Treasury Board. Treasury Board has a final sign-off on it, so we're just waiting to see what the final outcome will be. Marilyn asks, long-term care facilities that need to be not-for-profit, will money be increased to help with budgets to help alleviate the situation they are in now? You know, in our riding of Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman, we have some wonderful care homes, both public and those that are private. I visit a lot of them all the time, and my father is in long-term care, and I know that he is cared for wonderfully in a government-run facility. So it is, the situation is not systemic in my mind. It's not a problem right across the board from coast to coast to coast. We know that there has been some long-term care facilities in BC that the Liberals allowed to get purchased up by the Chinese, state-run operation out of Beijing. Already 3 of those facilities have had to be taken over by the government of BC. We know that there's problems in Ontario, and the report that came out yesterday from Quebec paints a much better picture of the care that's happening there, just that there isn't enough staff to deal with the situation in Quebec. So that is, I think that healthcare delivery is always provincial jurisdiction. The federal government does fund healthcare, and there is the Canada Health Act. And there is 3 pillars in making sure that we have universality of healthcare across this country. Long-term care, and especially when we start dealing with palliative care, that has been terribly underfunded by the federal government. And as Conservatives, we've been calling on the Liberals to increase the amount of money available for palliative care and for long-term care. So the next question that I have here is Matt, and he asks, what would you like to see in support for reservists wanting to serve their country? Currently, job protection is very little. So I actually believe that the Canadian reserves, especially the Army reserves, should be increased in size and scope, and that we need to work with provincial jurisdictions who, most provinces have control over things like job protection. But I've been working very closely with a group out of Toronto called Canada Company. And Canada Company has been advocating, and it's a bunch of corporations, but they have been advocating for years that they want to see more companies offer job protection. So when reservists have to go away for extended period of time to serve or on training, that when they come home from the theater or from the training field, that their jobs are intact. And so it is now, I think, a pretty good discussion that is taking place between the federal government and the provinces to look at how they can properly bring in regulations to protect those that are signing up as reservists. What we witnessed this year, like in Operation Laser, is that a lot of the people that are serving are reservists. What we have seen in fighting forest fires and floods and other natural disasters across this country are reservists. It's our part-time soldiers. And so when they're called to the front line, whether it's domestically or internationally, and going abroad to serve in things like Operation Impact or Operation Unifier. Operation Impact, of course, was our service and operations in Iraq. Operation Unifier is in Ukraine. Of course, we have our NATO responsibilities, and we have lots of reservists that are serving that in the enhanced forward position that Canada is running out of Latvia. So when they need to go to be deployed to those areas, or they're put on ships and sailed around the world to participate in things like the Maritime Task Force and in the Mediterranean, or in anti-pirating operations along the coast of Africa, when those reservists deploy, then we need to make sure that they come home, that their jobs are there for them. So more needs to be done. I think it ultimately is not just about encouraging businesses to do it, but it's also putting in place the proper regulatory mechanisms in place at the provincial level for those jobs that are overseen by the provincial jurisdiction versus the federal role. And I know that there is a lot of reservists who work for the federal government and where job protection is much easier. So Clem asks, when will the churches be allowed to gather again? It's a great question, Clem, and this is up to the provinces to make those decisions. I think that being allowed to gather and worship is a basic right, a charter right here in Canada as part of our freedom of religion. And I would encourage the province to move quicker so that we can start looking at opening up our places of faith. So, you know, we've been doing church online at home. It's been interesting, to say the least. Kind of neat just to lay on the couch and watch the church service with Pastor Henry. But I can tell you that it's still not the same as coming together and to worship. And I would also say that you know, encourage your MLAs to work at making sure that we can have our places of worship open up. The one thing that, you know, the province of Manitoba has done already is that we can gather in groups of up to 50 now outside. So as long as social distancing is respected, and I think that's something that we can definitely start looking at as faith groups on how we come together to worship. You know, maybe we can have that church picnic again sooner than later. Just might have to do it in 2 or 3 sittings, depending on the size of your church. Robert and Will have both asked, why won't the other opposition parties join the Conservatives to take down this minority Liberal government? When are we going to have that vote of non-confidence? So that non-confidence vote, earliest it can happen now is in September. Of course, the Bloc are just happy to be back up to, you know, 34 members. When they last Parliament and Parliament before that, they were not even officially recognized. They didn't have the minimum number of members. And the NDP, I always like to tease my NDP buddies. They have to be so happy right now they got their first NDP Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau is the most left-wing Prime Minister Canada has ever seen. And so they have to be pretty excited about having Justin Trudeau. Somebody's asking, why isn't the Governor General not stepping in and making Parliament go back to session? Well, Governor General is there to essentially to rubber stamp what the government brings forward. She has a constitutional role to play, but at this point in time, I don't believe that she sees that there's been any violation of our fundamental government or Westminster-style Parliament because of COVID-19. So nobody's heard her express any concern. Shelley asks, what can the Conservatives do to curb Trudeau's spending? The spending was terrible even before COVID hit. Some of the COVID spending has had to be out there to help people, but it feels like it's out of hand. How do you feel about this, and what are your solutions to this uncontrolled spending? Well, first thing is we got to get government back in the House of Commons, not in a special committee, but actual have Parliament sit. We need our committees working. We only have 9 committees working right now. National Defence, for example, isn't working. So we need to have committees sit and scrutinize the spending. The debt that's getting piled on, at the end of last fiscal year, our national debt was around $685 billion. And of course, during the good times that the Liberals had, they inherited surpluses that were left by the Conservative government. And of course, every year they've been racking up $20 to $30 billion in national debt. And so those deficits become debt, and those debts become tomorrow's taxes. And so our children and grandchildren are going to be paying for this. Now, what Trudeau used to always like to brag about. He says, well, we don't have to worry, is that, on a ratio basis, our national debt is, only like 23 or 24% of GDP. Well, with how our economy is faltering because of COVID, how things have collapsed, there is, and then all this increased spending of an extra $250 billion, we could very well hit, in the next 12 months, $1 trillion in national debt. And we could be sitting closer to 50% of national debt to GDP ratio. That is not tenable. That is how we got into trouble back in the 80s under the first under Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Trudeau Point 1. And that's why we need to start moving forward in putting a cap on spending, getting back in control of what government programs are absolutely necessary to fund first the social safety net and normal government operations, but we are going to have to go really hard and real deep to get these books back in order. And I don't expect Trudeau will do anything to stop it. And I don't expect the NDP or the Bloc will want him to stop. It was kind of funny. I was actually listening to the Bloc yesterday, and one of their questions, they actually are getting concerned about the amount of spending going on as well because of how much national debt is going to be, even though they're separatists. They know that some of this national debt is going to be passed on to Quebec if they ever did succeed in separation. So, that is something that, we have to take a hard look at is the books. Guess what? We can't see the books. The federal government the Liberals have cut back the amount of budget available to the Auditor General. The Auditor General can't even do the audits that the government and Parliament and opposition parties have asked her to undertake. So it's just a sad case without any, what we essentially have right now is Liberals are running roughshod over our normal democratic processes and just spending, like a lot of people like to say they're spending like drunken sailors. Well, guess what? Drunken sailors at least spend their own money. These Liberals are spending all of our money. Sid asks, what are your thoughts on Trudeau calling for another election and are we ready? Well, Sid, that's a great question. I actually believe that if Trudeau sees partisan and political advantage, he will go to the Governor General and request an early election. And just on the premise that he needs a new mandate from the people of Canada to manage the recovery after COVID-19. He will want to look at the lay of the land, and once we get to a position of selecting a new leader in the Conservative Party, then he may want to do what John Chrétien did to Stockwell Day and call a snap election. So we need to be wary of that. There's no doubt that we are moving ahead with our leadership race, that we will know shortly after the end of August, during the end of August, we'll know who our next leader will be. And then we can start focusing on making sure the party is in shape to move forward. Andrew Scheer has worked hard at trying to keep the party positioned to deal with a snap election, trying to leave the House in good order, but there's no doubt that during COVID-19, the number of donations coming into our party, as well as other political parties, has slowed down considerably. And of course, all leadership candidates are competing for those donor dollars as well, so it's a double whammy to the Conservative Party. So it is important. I know that a lot of us have financial difficulties because of COVID-19, but I still encourage you, if you can give $10, give $10 to help our party get prepared for a snap election. Daryl asks, Can you assure that you will advocate for community senior centers? And then he used the example of a senior center that I'm very familiar with, Bowhead in Beausejour, is vital to our community, yet due to continued necessary restrictions are not able to open, and bills continue to pile up. So their financial reserves are being used up and sustained support is needed. So I know that I've worked very closely with Wayne Owasco, Emily for Lactabani, and lives just outside of Beausejour, on supporting the Bowhead Senior Center. It's a great organization. I've been able to secure funding in the past for capital projects. Now, the federal government never pays for operational expenses. There's no program in the federal regime that does it, but the New Horizons funding for Senior Center is things that are always there, and I will continue to advocate for that type of funding. But I will be talking to Wayne, and we'll see, what happens with some of these problems. That it's not just senior centers; it's all sorts of different community clubs that are being impacted. They're not open. They're not doing their fundraisers. All of us realize how many of our socials have been canceled across Manitoba, and those are usually the main way for service clubs and senior centers and youth groups to make money. And unfortunately, nobody is able to do that. So, direct requests for donations is going to be, I think, the way forward, and then hopefully, between all levels of government, there'll be some way to support them. So, and I'm going to close with this one last question, because I know that there's been a lot of people have been asking me, why am I supporting Peter Mackay for the Conservative Party? I've had the pleasure of serving with 3 out of the 4 candidates that are running. They're all my friends. Leslie Lewis, who I have not met, I find her to be very impressive, what I've seen of her on TV and the way she's been conducting herself through this campaign. But I'll say this, that when it comes to having a strong leader for our party, when it comes to having someone that can stand up to Justin Trudeau, when it comes down to finding someone that can beat Justin Trudeau, there's only one name left, and his name's Peter Mackay. Peter has the experience. He's been a parliamentarian. He's been a Crown prosecutor. He's held some of the biggest portfolios. And of course, we have a modern Conservative Party of Canada because of Stephen Harper and Peter Mackay. It was because of their collaboration that they founded our party. And Peter was trusted by Stephen Harper. He was always on the inner circle, held the biggest cabinet jobs from Justice, Foreign Affairs, and of course is Canada's longest serving Minister of Defence during wartime. And the experience that he gleaned of being in cabinet, of sitting right beside Stephen Harper, including serving as deputy leader when we were in opposition, will serve him well as we have to start pulling out of COVID-19. He is doing very well in French. He will win where we aren't winning right now. We have to win more seats in Atlantic Canada. We have to win more seats in Quebec, and we definitely have to win seats in the large urban centres. And he resonates in places like the GTA and the Greater Vancouver region. And by getting more seats, we will form government. And Peter is talking about keeping a strong, united party. He doesn't color code us. He's welcoming everybody from all different segments of the conservative movement, from libertarian to social conservatives to fiscal conservatives. He's tough on justice. He's a military hawk, and is someone that resonates right across this country. So I'm just one vote. And I know each and every one of you that are members of the Conservative Party will have your vote, but I do ask that you support Peter Mackay. And as you saw with his rollout yesterday of his jobs plan, he is the Prime Minister who can put our economy back on our feet. He will be our jobs Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau is our debt Prime Minister, and we have to stop the debt. We have to stop Justin Trudeau before Justin Trudeau destroys our country. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have any specific questions that I didn't get to now, please reach out to my office. You can email office@jamesbazan.com. We have been getting a lot of emails, hundreds and hundreds of emails every day during this pandemic, but we are trying to stay on top of it. And so with our staff of 6 over the summer, we will continue to get to your emails and phone calls as quick as we can, get the answers you need. And you know what? Let me know how you felt about doing the Facebook Live event. We've been doing Zoom. Zoom's a little more of an interchange because people can actually ask you questions on Zoom as well, and we'll do some more of those in the future. As I always have been saying to everyone right now, is I do ask that even though things are getting better in Manitoba, I think we're down to around only, as of last night, it was 14 active cases in Manitoba. It's definitely higher in other places across this country, but let's keep following the advice of our public health officials, and let's stay safe and stay healthy. And I know that all of us are looking forward to spending time in the great outdoors this summer. Thanks for joining me. Have a good one.